Sorry about that. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to talk about the non-healthcare related issues, and I lied. But I'm pretty much wrapping that part of it up. So it is hypothetically possible that libertarians could make vague arguments and just always say, well, there isn't a free market, hence the government did it. Although that is a potential criticism that I see used, that I think socialist or pro-government people use all the time. Just, oh, well, uh, the role of government isn't total, so it's the lack of control that is clearly the result, the problem. And when it comes to healthcare, this is pretty evident. Um, the United States does not have a free market in healthcare. Uh, before Obamacare, roughly 45% of all money spent on healthcare was directly spent by the government, as in the federal, state, local governments spent that money. All the rest, the 55% that wasn't spent by the government, almost all the rest was in insurance, which the government subsidizes. Government either requires people to have insurance in various industries and various unions, and also through the way the tax structure, it taxes income, but it doesn't tax uh, income you get that goes into an insurance policy. So that's subsidizing insurance. They regulate hospitals through licensure. They regulate drug companies. They regulate medical schools. There's just enormous government involvement in healthcare. At almost half the dollars directly, indirectly, almost all but the only people who aren't even indirectly paying for the state would be the 8 or 9% that pay out of pocket always, which, so not much. Um, and in the debate in the United States, um, if we were to look at it, we say, okay, there's government and there's market. So assuming that there's a problem with the medical care in the United States, which there is, one has to analyze it to decide, well, is this problem because there isn't enough government care, or is it the problem caused by the government, or is it caused by something else? And you alleged that prior to the NHS there was, quote, a free market in healthcare in Britain. Now, I do not know a great deal about the medical history of Great Britain, but I just typed in Google history of medical regulation in the UK. There's a very brief Wikipedia article on that, and it characterized the pre NHS legislation healthcare as a patchwork of private, charity, and municipal regulations. Now, that's not a free market. Now, how much of the pre-NHS, was it 90% market and 10% municipal regulations? I don't know. Wikipedia didn't say, but there is government involvement there. And sure enough, there was a major piece of medical regulation passed in 1859. So almost 100 years before the NHS, 90 years, well, 80 years before the NHS was passed. And so the idea that there was a free market, no, there was government involvement. Now, that's not to say necessarily that it was government involvement that failed the poor, as you kept saying, but there was government involvement, so we have to be a little bit more honest in our assessment than to just say, well, the free market must have failed, because the government was involved in the industry. And by some of your other definitions of free market, where you said free market means no government involvement in the industry, even if the government wasn't involved in the medical industry, the fact that it was involved in other industries, by your definition, would mean that there wasn't a free market. So we have to be more nuanced in our analysis of social issues than uh, routinely making the correlation equals causation fallacy. I know now. I think I'll kind of come back to this in a minute, but uh, you say that the fact that the government is doing it proves that it was a problem. And in your first video, you didn't only say that. You said it proves that government intervention was necessary. The fact that the government's intervening is evidence that it was necessary for the government to become involved. Now, most of my first video to you was saying that's a silly argument because that would justify every action by every government ever in history. And I'm glad that that's not actually your position. But what you're now saying is, well, it proves that there was a problem, because if nobody thought there was a problem, then there wouldn't have been any new legislation. This is true, but it's true. It's too true. It's too broad to really argue for government intervention. Why? Because a societal problem could be defined as anybody anywhere in society thinks that there's a problem, which is not what you mean. You want a more specific type of general welfare than just somebody somewhere thinks it's a good idea. Um, but I think this is still wrong, because the genesis of much government regulation, and I think the majority, if not nearly all of it, is some group of people, sometimes in government, sometimes out of government, thinking we could benefit, or another word for benefit, profit, if the government does X. That's the genesis of most legislation. Somebody somewhere, again, often without government, sometimes within government, thinks there's a way I can make money if the government passes some type of law. And then they do. Now, a good example that ties into our healthcare debate. The first major regulation of U.S. healthcare occurred way back in the first decade of the 20th century, and it was basically when the government mandated licensure for doctors. Before that, anyone who wanted to could become a doctor. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily do any business. If you couldn't prove to people that you had some kind of demonstrable skill in the craft of medicine, it's unlikely that you would have any patients, or if you did, you wouldn't have them for very long. And the only way that you could thrive in such an industry is to do well. People think that you're doing a good job providing them medical services. Now, the after the fact justification is this as well. The government needs to have licensure and regulations for consumer protections. We don't want to have quacks out there performing poor, even very dangerous medical procedures on people. And so it's a good idea for the government to set some kind of minimum standard or whatever. Whether you feel that way or not, that's not how it happened. How it happened is the American Medical Association, the AMA, which is a private club of doctors. It doesn't include all doctors. There was no rule that said everyone who had to be a doctor had to be in the AMA. They looked around and they thought, and they were explicit about this, we could all make higher salaries if the government restricted the number of people who were doctors, because as it is, anyone who wants to can try. Doesn't mean they all succeed, but the fact that there's so many people becoming doctors, and by the way, providing massive amounts of medical care at low prices, that means we can't charge as much. And there is no way for the AMA to prevent that from happening. These doctors can't go around on their own and prevent people from becoming doctors. It's not possible. They could try, but they'd be outnumbered by the potential people who would want to become doctors. They would be seen as criminals for going around and attacking potential competition. Just think if McDonald's started going around trying to attack anyone who started another restaurant. It wouldn't work. So what do? They lobby the government, and they said, you can't come and say, well, we want to have higher wages, so ban all of our competition and require everyone who wants to be a doctor to get a license and to join the AMA. So you couch it in consumer protectionist. But that's the goal. That was the whole point. And of course they got it. Now, they got licensure, they were able to charge higher prices, and the rest of us had to pay more for our medical treatment because of it. Now, you could, in the very broad sense, say, well, the doctors wanted to get paid more. That's a social problem, and so this would meet your definition of there having been a problem. Now, the problem was that healthcare was too cheap and too readily available, and so a group of self-interested individuals, in this case doctors comprising the AMA, or at least some large majority of the doctors in the AMA, I doubt it was literally every single one of them, said, let's have the government restrict our competition so we can become richer. And that is not an isolated example. That is the genesis of all regulation within society. The government gets lobbied by the sugar industry, by the auto manufacturers, by the unions who don't want to compete with foreign labor or cheap domestic labor, by the aircraft industry. For instance, Pan American used to try and prevent any other competition from being around. The phone companies for a long time have monopolies. The broadcast companies who were granted a state oligopoly back in 1927 lobbied for decades to prevent there to be any competition for them, uh, preventing things like HBO from ever arising, or cable news, or cable anything. And they succeeded for many years, and that doesn't prove that it was, and their success manifests as government regulation of this or that industry. And that doesn't prove that there was a problem in the sense that you mean. There was a problem in the sense that a certain group or industry wanted to make more money at our expense, at the expense of their consumers, and the only way they could do that is to have the government restrict their competition, or even completely eliminate their competition, even outlaw it, or subsidize them in some other way, maybe just giving them lots of money, like farm subsidies or solar panel companies or any number of other groups. But this is the genesis of all government policy. And sometimes the interest group is within the government, because bureaucracies in government and bureaucrats within government are incentivized to grow their departments, to grow their agencies, to have more people on their payroll, and to extend the influence of their agencies always. Every agency that's ever existed has what they call mission creep. And it's not because it's always becoming a better and better idea. You know, none of this, the growth of government bureaucracies never happens because the regular people are like, man, there is a social problem and it would just be solved if the TSA had more power, or if FEMA had more power, or the ATF, or the FBI. No, all that happened because people within government decided it would be a good idea if they had more power. And this meets your kind of very broad definition, because people in government are part of society and they think that life would be better if they had more power. And so, yes, the instigation of government power in those instances is arising from society, but I don't think that's what you really have in mind. You think you have this kind of idea that the masses want the government to solve some problem and they beseech it to increase its power, and against the evil special interests who are trying to stop the government from saving the day somehow. And that's just totally a myth. It's completely opposite of that. And it's certainly the case in medical care. In the United States, it's totally the case in medical care. I don't know the details about the UK, but I think it probably parallels it pretty well. Um, Now, you seem to put a lot of stock in this Attlee report. I don't know how you can put so much trust in a government report about that, especially one that concludes that the solution is that the government should have more power. Um, that's not to just say that every government report must be a lie, but one can seriously question that. The regulations that I know existed in the UK in the medical industry prior to the passage of NHS were licensure agreements for doctors, which by definition and by design are intended to raise the cost of healthcare, which is going to hurt the poor more than anybody else. Now, was that the only problem? I don't know. But that right there tells me, why didn't they say allow poor people, make it easier for people to receive medical care? Let's not have all these hurdles preventing people from becoming doctors just so the doctors can be richer. I don't know. The point that the idea that a government report that advocates the government have more power, if I just that should be almost, that'd be like if Walmart came out with a report that says Walmart should have more power. Would you find that maybe a little unlikely? Maybe they're biased, and you know either deliberately altered the report or just psychologically, what they desire made its way subconsciously in there rather than just take it for granted. The government is not an objective institution. It is not more honest, more able to self-assess. It doesn't think in the longer term. It's selfish, greedy people, just like everybody else. They do everything because they think it will benefit them. Even when they do things that they think are altruistic, it's doing it because they think it would be beneficial to them. So the I mean, your argument is just too broad to say, well, the fact that the government did something proves that it was a societal problem. Well, sure, but that's being too broad. It proves that somebody thought that government policy would be a good idea, but that somebody very often is the government, and always it's somebody who thinks they're going to profit from it. Always. And I know profit's an evil word. So, I mean, and look, I mean, England, there's so many examples of this. Do you really think that anyone in England, I mean, England, like, this has this long history of these trade monopoly companies, and I know you're worried about monopolies on the free market, but where does that word even come from? It comes from all these, or actually originally in French it was called the privilège, and it was the monarch granting monopolies to certain groups of individuals. Do you think that anyone in England was thinking in the 16th and 17th century, what we really need is we need to have a group of investors who have a monopoly on all trade with a given area? So what we really need in England is a couple people who own all the trade with, say, Canada, or all the trade with India or Moscow. The first one was actually the Moscow Company. The only people in society who think that are the investors who want to form that monopoly. And they don't want there to be competition because they want to be able to charge as much as possible. And so what do is they go to the government, and this could be the monarch or it could be parliament. It happened quite a bit both ways, and say, here's the deal. You give us a monopoly, you prosecute anybody who tries to undercut our prices, so we'll make a nice handsome profit, and we'll pay you some of that profit. So you don't have to front any money, you're just going to have revenue by giving us a monopoly, and the revenue you get and our high profits, that's going to come out of the backs of the consumers of our products. The only people in England who ever wanted that were the investors in whatever company we're talking about, whether it be the East India Company, the Northwest Company, the Hudson Bays Company, the Moscow Company. Those are the most famous ones. I couldn't even tell you all the other ones. And those are just little examples. Little examples. Of course, some of those companies had private armies and annihilated entire populations of native groups, but whatever. And in the United States, it's the same deal, more or less. And yeah, so we don't have a free market in healthcare. You didn't have a free market in healthcare prior to NHS. There was a mixed economy, just as there always is. Even a little bit analysis of that reveals that government intervention consistently raises prices. And this is an argument I made in my first video, and I even explicitly said that the main thrust of the libertarian argument isn't to just say, well, the rich will be charitable and help the poor. History says they will be. History says that they will be, but that's not the main argument. The main argument that I put forward, that you did not address, is that on a free market, prices tend to fall and quality tends to rise. And so any question about, any issue that may exist with poverty is likely to become alleviated over time. Yeah, how much time? It depends uh, on how much prosperity is coming about and how you define poverty. Now, you reference this argument, but not in a sense to refute it. You made the argument that this somehow supports your idea about taxation, because you say, well, if what you're saying is true, then we can put taxes on the rich, because then their decreased income from the taxation, that just means that whoever might be ill affected with that will just become more efficient, and then it doesn't matter. So if they have to cut down 50% on their yacht consumption, then the yacht companies will just become more efficient and make up the difference. This would only be true if the market is able to step by step match whatever new taxes are imposed. And in the short run, meaning potentially decades, this isn't going to be the case unless the taxes are very small. Now, if there's a 1/100th% increase in the taxes, sure, they're going to be able to make. It's not going to hurt them. If there's a 50% increase in taxes, no industry is going to become 50% more efficient overnight, at least generally. Maybe once in every long time there might be something that will do that, but that's rare. Typically, if you have 25% taxes, the industry is going to be completely shot, and maybe in several years or decades it'll eventually catch up. But so it's totally illogical to think that any amount that the government takes out is just going to be replaced by efficiency in the market, because the trend in the market doesn't match what the government, what you're saying was true. For what you're saying to be logically true all the time, you would have to say that, well, if the government has 100% tax, then everything will become 100%, not even 100%, infinitely more efficient, so that they would be able to provide the goods and services at no cost, because the government's taxing all money, so they'd be able to provide the goods for no price. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Now, the other thing that you brought up is, and I think this will be kind of my last point, even though we're like a fucking hour into this. Oh, I have a gun, by the way. One of my guns. What was I going to say here? Oh, okay. Now, your argument was, okay, the rich person, we tax them, they don't spend as much on yachts, and so the yacht worker loses some revenue. Either he loses his job or he makes less uh, because of this. But you said it's all right, though, because that taxes is going to be taken by the government, and then they're going to hand it out back. And so the lost revenue of the yacht person is going to be repaid in the services, in this case medical care, but could be hypothetically any service. And so he's no worse off. That would only be true is if there was some magic multiplier, and for every dollar that goes to the government, you get a dollar back, which doesn't square. Because the government itself will consume at least some, and actually a great percentage of what it brings in through taxes. All right, so a 5 billion pounds of additional tax revenue to the Treasury, to the Exchequer in the UK. Is it called the Exchequer? I don't know. I know they used to, but I don't know if that's still the case. Doesn't mean that poor people get 5 billion pounds in medical care or education or whatever. It means some portion of it, and it's usually a pretty decent chunk. We're talking at least 20-30%, and sometimes more like 50%, is going to be consumed by the bureaucracy. It's going to go to wages of bureaucrats, to the administration of their facilities, to new facilities, upkeep, whatever. Some of it's going to be lost. They're going to be paying janitors to mop the floors. I always hear the NHS has an enormous bureaucracy, and how your healthcare becomes cheaper to have a whole bunch of administrators, I'm not sure. I mean, you not just have nurses and doctors on salary, you have, correct me if I'm wrong, but even more people who don't do any of that stuff who are on salary. So then what comes out at the end, it's not like it's money in the pocket either, because the government uh, doesn't really know how to spend the money, and so they may build hospitals, they may put medical equipment in there, but they don't know what the most demanding things are. They don't know what kind of medical care people are going to want. They can look at the past and try and kind of guess what they think is the best way to spend it, but it's pretty. And there's kind of a neat analogy here. There's an old World War II movie called A Bridge Too Far about the battle for Arnhem, and there's all these mostly British paratroopers drop behind German lines, and Of course, they start to run out of supplies, and it gets to be, they don't have any medical care, and they don't have any ammunition, and unfortunately, all the planes are dropping their supplies in the German behind German lines, and so they're not getting resupplied. And finally, one of the soldiers just makes a Herculean effort. He runs across a field and he grabs one of these big, looks like a torpedo, a container. The plane dropped, hoping, I'm going to get this back to my mates and we're going to have some supplies and maybe live another day. And he gets machine gunned before he makes it back, and he falls and he drops. And the canister opens and reveals it's not full of ammunition and it's not full of medical supplies, but it was full of nice red berets, part of their uniform. And I think that's pretty analogous, because even after they say tax 5 billion pounds and say, let's be generous and say they only waste 500 million pounds in administration, which is really generous, so they have 4.5 million pounds to spend. They're going to spend it all over the place, and a lot of what they spend it on is not going to necessarily help anyone or help a particular person. And so it's an open question to just assume that if they tax 5 billion pounds out of society, that society is going to get 5 billion pounds back. You're just assuming that and just saying, oh, well, the taxes don't hurt because they're just going to get it back. No, they don't. There's no multiplier. There's a diminution of the wealth. It goes through a sieve, and the government keeps some of it. And what comes out the bottom, it's not what I mean. If if I get 100% of my income, then I'm going to spend that 100% on what I think is the most important to me, the things that I value the most, and it's probably going to be healthcare, it's going to be housing, whatever else. All right, if you take 20% of my income, then I'm going to have to give up 20% of the things that I value to spend on. They're going to be gone. And is the government going to give me back exactly what I would have bought otherwise? I mean, do you get to, the only way this would work is if you got to write to the government and say, dear government, this year I paid this much in taxes, or I lost this much because you taxed my employer because I like to buff the floors on yachts. And so, please, this is what I was going to buy with the money that I no longer could because you took it. And so, please provide me with these substitutes. No, no. The government's going to just do something and say, thank the hell out of us. And that's not fucking good enough. I know there's other problems here. You say, well, the rich person is not going to get their money back, but the poor person, and you talk about people who don't pay any taxes, they're obviously going to get a net benefit because they're going to get much more back than they could possibly pay in taxes. And this is never true on net for all society, because there's always going to be more net taxpayers than net tax receivers. But there are going to be individuals, a minority always, but individuals who, this is true, where they get more in taxes than they pay in. But one has to wonder about the efficacy of that, both in moral terms and utilitarian terms. Moral terms, what you're saying is then they're entitled to the fruits of other people's labor, which is slavery. If you say that they're just entitled to it without conditions, they get to have it, and anyone who tries to refuse to pay the taxes to give them whatever the service is, gets punished by the government, then that's slavery. It is. It's very, very morally, at the very least, ambiguous. But the other utilitarian problem is the incentive all of a sudden becomes to take as much as possible. At that point, if you say, well, I'm just going to get free things, then I'm going to support any politician who promises to give me even more. And you have this in Britain, where you have all of your overeducated, underemployed young people rioting for even more bullshit. They want unemployment. I mean, to get paid for not working. They want to have vacations and free education. Although their education doesn't seem to be buying them anything, they should just get more. And on and on and on. Of course, this happens in the United States too, but not nearly as bad. And that is a cycle that can't go forever. It's not like Scrooge McDuck's wealth goes all the way to the bottom of the earth. You can only take so much. Uh, so I definitely think about that. Now, a couple other things you brought up. Um, if we don't have the government, businesses will only cater to the rich. All right, what's a bigger company, Toyota or Bentley? What's a bigger company, the ones that import caviar or Walmart? Hmm. You know, what are bigger companies, the ones that build yachts or the ones that build speedboats that regular people can afford? The rich don't consume very much relative to their wealth. You know, if you're a million times richer than the average person, you don't eat a million times more. You eat the same. Maybe you live luxuriously and you spend 10 times as much on food as the average person or whatever. You eat $600 cheeseburgers every day and you eat caviar every day. Then that's still not a million times. You know, companies that cater to rich people are small. Walmart is big because it caters to the masses. Toyota and Honda and Nissan and Ford and GM are big, and Rolls-Royce is not, doesn't even compare, or Bentley does not even compare, or um, Lamborghini, or I mean, the highest end cars you can get are from those Italian manufacturers, not Volkswagen. But what's a bigger company, Volkswagen or Daimler Benz or Mercedes? So this logic's totally false. The idea that doctors would not provide medical care to poor people because they're rich people is just absolutely silly, because there is money to be made from poor people, because poor people demand a good and they're willing to pay for it. Anyone who can provide that will make money. And so they don't care, the Waltons don't care that people think that their business is based on white trash, because they are billionaires for providing cheap products. And by cheap I mean low cost, but also actual cheap in a lot of cases, uh, to white trash. And that's golf club that has snotty nose, St. Augustine's, or what's that golf club in Georgia that only lets millionaires be in it? Like, they are nothing in terms of wealth compared. So that's just silly. Uh, there's one other point I wanted to make, as if an hour isn't enough. Shit. That's what I get for making unscripted videos. Um, hmm. Uh, Someone help me out here. What am I missing? Hmm. Put the Jeopardy music on. Oh, I remember. I hope anyone who watched that, at one point you say, the free market can't promise that everyone will be taken care of. Yes, this is true. I cannot guarantee that if we lacked a government, every person everywhere would get everything they quote need or want. And there might be really sad cases. You might have a poor person who can't afford health care, and they fall between the cracks of charity. And even though health care is getting cheaper and cheaper, and even though there's no taxes and there's great prosperity, maybe nobody cares in this one instance, or maybe the circumstances are such that people aren't even aware that they're ill and they die. Or maybe they go and they receive medical treatment, but it's inferior for some reason. maybe they got the cut rate stuff and it just wasn't right, and maybe if they had gone to the most expensive clinic they would have been okay, but they went to the Walmart clinic, and normally Walmart clinic's okay, but in this case it wasn't up to snuff and they die. That's true. But you know what? That is not a good argument against free markets, because I can hypothetically have someone be let down in any system, including yours, and your system lets people down too. If free market is invalidated because it's hypothetically possible for somebody to not be given quality service, then the NHS has been invalidated hundreds of thousands of times over, because the NHS fails people too. People die. People die in the NHS. And not because of insoluble problems after the state exhausted all of its resources to try and help them. Because they die on waiting lists, because they get inferior care. I've heard all kinds of reports and stories that basically they favor certain groups, and other groups they say, you're too old, you don't pay taxes, we're not giving you that cancer treatment. We'll put you on a morphine tap and let you die. Or how about this? If you find out you're sick, they say, okay, we need to run some tests. They run some tests. They say, okay, you're going to run some more tests. It's going to be a couple months. You run the more tests 5-6 months later. Turns out you had cancer. It's metastasized. You're terminal now. If they had done it right away, maybe you had a chance. Or maybe you won't die. Maybe they'll be able to treat you, but it'll be much worse. I know in Canada there's a whole industry of medical tourism where people who get diagnosed with problems that the state says, well, we will treat it eventually, which is not good enough for a lot of people, then they go someplace else. A lot of times the United States. There's some hospitals in the United States close to the Canadian border that are just packed with Canadians escaping their national health service in Canada, but also to places where healthcare is pretty cheap, like in India, Indonesia, Thailand, that sort of thing. I saw one case. There's a video on YouTube. It's called Two Women. I recommend you watch it. This woman developed some kind of bladder condition. They were able to diagnose it, and they said, well, what you need, they need to put in an electrical implant, and that electrical implant will basically stabilize your bladder, and you'll be fine. They said, and it will be free, but we only do a dozen a year. You're the 36th person on the list, so 3 years you'll get it done. And that wasn't long enough. If they waited that long, her problem would persist and become incurable after a certain point. And they offered to pay, even though they are taxed through the ass, to provide them. They said, well, we'll pay extra to get it done early. And they said, that's not Canadian. And she has a catheter now, and she will for the rest of her life. She didn't die. Her life has just been horribly, horribly ruined, and she fell through the cracks. Just like any sap story you could tell me about a free market that maybe let someone fall through the cracks, she fell through the cracks. So does that prove that the system is completely failed? I mean, if you're going to say free market is invalidated because there's one person that I can imagine hypothetically not getting care, well, it happens in Sweden, it happens in England, it happens everywhere. And the only difference is the people in the national health services, they have to pay the cost, but they don't get necessarily the quality. You know, if you're poor in a free market system, at least you weren't taxed your entire life to pay for a medical treatment that you're not even going to receive, or that's going to be inadequate, which it very often is. And I have subscribers in the UK, and they don't all have rosy pictures of what goes on there as much as you want to imagine it. And what you just want to hear is to be promised. But, you know, the government can promise they're going to help everybody. That doesn't mean it's actually going to happen, and it never does. Because the NHS doesn't mean that there's an infinite supply of medical services. No, I mean, people have this belief that if the government runs healthcare, then the government will provide everybody with whatever they need, and that's not the case. The government can't do that. I mean, it would be profligate if it even tried. If it just said, anyone wants to walk into any hospital, get any treatment that they want anytime. Would that work? No. It would never work, because then everyone would come in for every little thing, and how do they decide? How do they decide who needs treatment and who doesn't need treatment? They have to ration the supply of healthcare. They have to set up a system where they decide who's going to get treated and who's not. And you know what? That's going to be based on their priorities and what they value, not some objective truth of what's more valuable or less valuable. They're not in a position to say. They don't know that. So this is the proof by hypothetical circumstance, where you say, I can imagine a scenario where this won't work. I can imagine a scenario where the universal health care fails, and it does all the time. Now, if you want to make pragmatic arguments of which one's going to fail more, fine. But if you're going to say free market's invalidated because it can't promise that every poor person everywhere will get the best medical treatment possible, well, guess what? You don't get the best medical treatment possible. Your cancer survivor rates are way worse. You have medical tourists. Your political elites, when they can, go to other hospitals in other countries, and they can afford it. They get better treatment, though. It's true in Canada, too. Politicians and hockey players always get preferential treatment to the peons. So, I mean, and they know that they have you by the balls too. They know that you have to do what they say because they own your body. They decide what treatment you get, when you get it, if you get it. You don't get to decide what kind of drugs you want to take. You don't decide what kind of cancer treatment you want. The doctors don't work for you. They work for the state. That is their master, not you, not the consumer. And they don't give a shit if you die. And you brought up the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. It's not harming somebody if they get hurt and then you don't help them. You're not harming them. They harmed themselves or were harmed by unfortunate circumstances that can't be faulted to anybody. So much for that. But yeah, the Hippocratic Oath, unless the state's paying you and the state decides not to help somebody, which they do all the time, they have to. They have to ration it. They can't just say, why are the waiting lists so long? Hours or months. Is it because they hate everybody? No, it's because they don't have the resources to give everybody what they need. And so they have to pace it. So please don't have this absurd fairy tale version of reality where National Health Service means that everyone gets all the health care that they can imagine. I'm sure they promise that, but they don't deliver on it. And the fact that free market people are honest enough to say it doesn't mean everyone's going to get whatever they want. What it does mean is that the quality of healthcare is going to increase. Its availability is going to increase also because it's going to become cheaper. And isn't that a nice trend? Government-run institutions become more and more expensive, more and more bureaucratic, less and less quality over the years. I mean, and so what trend, what progression of events would you rather see? So, all right, this is fucking long. Kudos to anyone who watches both of these. They're going to have to be divided, but whatever. All right, that's it.